Okay, welcome back to learning part 2C. All right, so superstitious behavior. This is something that can actually be recreated in the laboratory environment. And B.F. Skinner did this quite a few times with rats and pigeons. So the way to do this is to reward after a certain amount of time, no matter what, completely unrelated to whatever behavior that rat or that pigeon was engaging in. So think about this. Every 15 seconds, a treat falls down into the cage, no matter what. So the rat could be sniffing itself or grooming itself, and then a treat falls down. Well, whatever it was doing right before that treat was dispensed, that behavior is likely to increase in frequency. So if you do this over and over again, these rats and these pigeons can engage in some pretty silly behavior, falsely thinking that that behavior is what's causing the treat to drop down. We can see this in lucky behaviors. I'm sure there's some people out there that might have some superstitions of their own. Athletes are a great example. I used to know a goalie, a hockey goalie, who would have to have his water bottles filled up the night before and kept in his personal refrigerator. So he couldn't just show up on game day and fill up water bottles there. If he did that, he thinks he'd had a bad game. So he'd have to do this every single night before a game. Now, did this have any actual influence on the outcome of his performance in a game? Realistically, no. But the fact that he thought it did actually did make it have an influence on how he performed in a game. So superstitious behaviors only have an influence on our behavior if we think they do. So they only have power if we give them power. All right, so how can we use the principles of operant conditioning in the real world? Well, we can look at relationships. It could be romantic relationships or friendships or maybe family relationships. And the big takeaway here is to use reinforcement over punishment. Punishment comes with a lot of baggage, and it's not as successful as reinforcement at altering behavior. So if you want your romantic partner to do the dishes more often, they're not doing their fair share of chores around the house. Every time they do the dishes, maybe you give them a hug or you do something nice for them. You encourage them to continue doing dishes instead of punishment, which would be just yelling at them every time they don't do the dishes, something like that. So, reinforcement over punishment, great way to have a positive impact on behavior. Animal training, we've already talked about this. Using the techniques of shaping, you can actually create some pretty complex looking behaviors. And specifically through the use of clickers, this would be our secondary reinforcer that avoids satiation. So this is a great way to extend training sessions. And we can also use these behavior modification techniques to increase healthy habits. And this is actually what a lot of different companies are doing. Nowadays, if you engage in healthy eating habits and healthy exercise habits, your company will actually give you a pretty significant discount on your health insurance premiums every month. So what's happening here? Well, you're saving money, which is a pleasant thing, and you are likely to increase the behavior of these healthy habits. So we've got a positive reinforcement thing going on here. All right, and then lastly, we're going to talk about learned helplessness. What is learned helplessness? This is a term given to us by Martin Seligman. And Seligman performed some experiments on dogs. And what he did is He took a bunch of dogs and split them up into two groups. One of these groups of dogs was placed in a cage and they were subjected to painful electric shocks. But this first group had a switch in their cage. And when the shocks started, they could push that switch and the painful shocking would stop. So you can imagine there's this dog in a cage, the shocks start, and pretty quickly they learn that if they push that lever, then they'll stop getting shocked. Now, the second group was also placed in that cage that would shock them, but this time they could not turn the shocks off. So you can imagine this poor dog put in the cage, they start getting shocked, and there's nothing they can do about it. Maybe they're freaking out at first, the shocks are really painful, they don't know what to do, they're looking all over the cage, they're howling, they're whining, but no matter what, the shocks just keep coming. So that's the first phase. You've got one group that can turn the shocks off, and you've got the other group that can't do anything about the shocks. Now, the second phase, they were given a chance to escape the cage. The door of the cage was just swung wide open. Now, the first group of dogs ran the hell out of that cage. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with those painful shocks. So they ran as far away from that cage as quickly as they could. Now, the surprising thing is that the second group did nothing. When that door to that cage swung open, they did not escape those painful shocks. They simply laid there and continued to get shocked. I love dogs, and I can't imagine how sad of an experiment this would be to be a part of. And Martin Seligman called this learned helplessness. The dogs in the second group learned there was nothing they could do to get away from those shocks. So even when the door of that cage swung open, it's almost like they just didn't believe that anything good would happen by running away from the cage. They already learned in the first phase there's no way they can avoid the shocks. Why would anything change just with that door being swung open? So, learned helplessness, this is sort of the laboratory proof of concept, but it actually applies outside of the laboratory too. Now, I'd like you to take about 5 or 6 minutes to watch the other video linked on the Canvas page. This is a college classroom, and they do a really quick little demonstration with some word games to show just how easy it is to induce learned helplessness in actual people in a real world setting. So, some other examples of learned helplessness in the real world: children giving up in school. You can imagine a little kid who is just not doing well in, let's say, math. So they're not good at math. They're just not getting it. They're failing their assignments. They're failing their exams. They're not doing well on their quizzes. And no matter how much studying they do, they just can't quite get it. So if they've learned that they're no good at this particular topic in school, there's a chance that they might give up in the rest of school. If they think they're bad at math, they might also think they're just a bad student in general. Nothing they do, no matter how much they study or how much they try, they keep getting these bad grades. Well, it's possible that they're just not a good student. At least that's what they would think. People who are trying to improve their health, maybe they don't see any improvement for, let's say, a whole week or maybe 2 weeks, because these types of healthy habit improvements do take a while to start to see the benefits. But let's say after 2 weeks, no improvement has been made. Well, that's another possible scenario of learned helplessness. No matter what improvements the person made to their diet, no matter how much exercise they engage in, they're still not seeing the health benefits that they want to see. So they give up. And the last example there is abusive relationships. People who are in these abusive relationships, the abusive partner will say such awful things like, even if you leave me, I will still find you. Or even if you leave me, you're still going to fail. You're still a loser. There's no way you can make it without me. And unfortunately, the person being abused will sometimes come to believe these sayings. They'll come to believe their abuser. That yes, even if I manage to escape, they're just going to hunt me down and find me, and we'll be back together. So abusive relationships is definitely an area where learned helplessness can be applied. All right, that is all I have for the learning unit. Thank you for your